Visibility is about attention. Being seen is about connection. Visibility is when more people know your name. Being seen is when someone encounters your work and somehow feels understood. Visibility can be measured, whereas being seen cannot. And I think many of us spend years pursuing visibility while quietly longing to be seen. Because they feel very similar from the outside, we tend to think that they create the same world internally, but they actually create very different lives on the inside. Living Content Era 2 is for the person who's already on the journey and is ready to go even deeper. It's for the deeply reflective human who knows that the gap between external success and internal alignment is real and is no longer willing to paper over it. It's for the woman who holds a lot in her home, in her career, in her community, and is starting to ask harder questions about who is she beneath everything she carries. It's for anyone who is excellent in every room and quietly unsettled on the drive home. It's for anyone who has done enough living to know that who you are in the inside shapes everything that happens on the outside, and who wants to talk about it honestly, without performance and without pretending. Hello sis and the brother in the room. Hello family. Welcome back to Living Content Podcast. I'm really grateful that you've chosen to spend this time with me yet again this morning, or whatever time you are listening this episode at. Whether you're listening while you are driving somewhere, taking your morning walk, making dinner, or maybe you've intentionally carved out to this hour just to yourself, and you're listening to this podcast episode. Thank you for inviting me into your space. I do not take that for granted, by the way. So if this is your first episode, welcome. Every conversation in this season stands on its own. So you've just arrived exactly where you are meant to be. And if you have been here since the beginning of Era 2, then you'll know that we are slowly building something together, right? We are learning what it means to lead ourselves before we try to lead anything else. And I mean anything else and everyone else. We are learning that becoming isn't always loud. Your evolution is not always loud, right? Sometimes it looks like telling ourselves the truth. Today's conversation has been sitting with me for a while. And some of you might have heard me speak about this because it's something that is so dear and very, very much close to my heart. I also wrote about it on my book in a different way though. And it's not because I finally found the answer, but because I've been living inside the question, and perhaps you too. A few months ago, after deciding to bring this podcast back, I found myself wrestling with something I hadn't expected. You know, when you have been away from something for a while, the world keeps moving, social media changes, the way people create changes, the advice changes. Everyone has an opinion about what it takes to grow. Be more visible, post more often, show more of your life, build your personal brand. People need to know you. And if I'm honest, there was a small part of me that wondered if I needed to come back differently. Maybe I needed to be louder. Maybe I needed shorter episodes. Maybe I needed to speak with more certainty. Maybe I needed to share more of myself. Maybe I needed to be someone else, just enough to fit what works. But every time I imagined that version of myself sitting behind this microphone, something inside me resisted. And it wasn't because I was afraid of being seen, but it was because I knew she wasn't me. I knew that I would be performing a persona that wasn't her, that wasn't me. And that resistance became a question. I often actually are able to think through things using questions and reflecting back to myself and sitting with that question that comes to the fore for me, to actually sit with that and see what it means. And that question for me was, how do you become more visible without becoming someone else? How do you become more visible without becoming someone else? Because we can easily perform something just for visibility. I don't think I'm the only one asking that question. Maybe your version has nothing to do with a podcast. Maybe you are stepping into leadership at work. Maybe you are starting a business. Maybe you've started writing something that you're afraid to publish. And I know very well, you can write something and get to a point where it's published ready, but in your mind, in your heart, you still think that there's more work required because you fear pressing publish, because you fear what it means when you put it out there, because it's not visibility of the work. There's something raw, something that belonged intimately to you that is now put out there, that is now being read by other people, and the interpretation of that work no longer sits with you, but the person who's reading the book, the person who's actually watching, and they are interpreting the work through their own lenses. So there's a feeling of wondering, how is this being received on the other end, right? So maybe you've written something you're afraid to publish. Maybe you finally decided to apply for the opportunity you've been talking yourself out of for years. Whatever your version looks like, at some point, visibility becomes part of the journey. And that's where most of the advice begins. Stop hiding. But what if that's too simplistic? What if there's more to the story than simply hiding? What if I told you that visibility is not the same as being seen? I've been thinking about this distinction a lot. Visibility is not the same as being seen. They are related, yes, and they are very much closely related, and sometimes we use them interchangeably as though we're speaking about the same thing. But they aren't the same. If you think about it, they aren't truly the same. Visibility is about attention. Being seen is about connection. Visibility is when more people know your name. Being seen is when someone encounters your work and somehow feels understood. Visibility can be measured, whereas being seen cannot. And I think many of us spend years pursuing visibility while quietly longing to be seen. Because they feel very similar from the outside, we tend to think that they create the same world internally, but they actually create very different lives on the inside. I've met people with remarkable careers who are surrounded by applause, who stand on podiums, who speak and minister to people, and yet feel profoundly unseen. I've also met people whose work reach fewer people, but every conversation they have feels deeply honest. The difference isn't numbers. It's whether the person everyone is applauding is still the same person who went into the room. That's the question that has been shaping me lately. Because the truth is, the world has a way of rewarding versions of us. You share something, people respond. You naturally think, perhaps I should do more of that. Perhaps I should repeat that. Perhaps I should do it again. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean it. There's nothing wrong with that. We all learn, we all grow, we all become better communicators, right? And we all learn from data that we receive, and it is meaningful insight still. But slowly, almost without perceiving it, you can begin repeating the version of yourself that receives the loudest applause. Until one day you pause and you wonder, is this still me? I don't think that happens overnight. I think it happens one small compromise at a time. One softened opinion that you truly hold and have. One truth that you left unsaid. One version of yourself repeated because it felt safer than saying something new. And that's why I don't think the real question is, how do I become more visible? How do I become visible? I think the better question is, how do I remain myself while becoming more visible? Because if visibility costs you yourself, if visibility leaves you behind, it has already become too expensive. I want to stay here for a moment because I think we use the word hiding far too casually. When someone is quiet, when someone takes longer, when someone isn't constantly putting themselves out there, we assume they are afraid. Sometimes they are, Sometimes, for real, they are shy. Sometimes they are aloof, as you call them. I remember one person calling me aloof, and I was like, what does that word even mean? And I then realized that it's pretty much said often by people who you haven't given yourself or a part of your life to, who you haven't exposed a certain part of your life to, that will perceive you as aloof. But people who you have welcomed and given a part of your life to, they pretty much understand that if judging from the whole entirety of you and who you are, they've had a different experience of you than to simply call you aloof. But anyway, I digress. So when someone isn't constantly putting themselves out there, we assume that they're afraid, right? We assume that they probably are shy. We assume that they're reserved. And sometimes truly they are. But fear is real. And I've known fear. I've known this type of fear of putting yourself out there. I've known the fear that makes you fold and you look like you're hiding. You've probably known this fear too. You're probably sitting, because I think it's a fear that many of us really hold, that many of us have. But sometimes what looks like hiding is actually discernment. Sometimes it's not necessarily fear that's sitting at the core of it, but discernment rather. Sometimes your spirit is saying, not like this. This isn't you. Not because you don't want to be seen, but because you don't want to disappear in the process. You don't want to disappear in your life, in performance of people perceiving you a certain way. I think there are many people listening today who have rich inner lives. You think deeply. You don't arrive at conclusions quickly. You don't always have the words immediately. You need time. You need silence. You need space. And then you look around and the world seems to reward immediacy. The world seems to reward instant, post it there, process it in real time while everyone is watching. Quick takes and fast opinions, constant updates, always being available, always being present, always producing. While something inside you quietly says, I don't know if I can live like that. I don't know if I still recognize you. Can I tell you something? That doesn't necessarily mean you're afraid. Sometimes it means your soul is protecting something precious. And I wish that you could see it that way. Sometimes your soul is protecting something precious. But integrity without courage eventually becomes isolation. There comes a point where your work still needs to leave your hands. Your voice still needs to enter the room. Not because the world deserves access to every part of you, but because someone may need what only you can say, only you have lived through, only you hold the testimony of, right? There is wisdom that only arrives through your life. And if you keep waiting until visibility feels completely safe, you may wait forever. So there's another distinction I've been learning to make. The difference between craft and performance. I think they are often confused. And I myself sometimes confuse them. Performance isn't always pretending. In fact, I don't think most people wake up one morning and decide they are going to become inauthentic, right? It happens much more quietly than that. It happens without us noticing that. You learn what people respond to. You notice which post receives the most engagement, which presentations earns the standing ovation, which version of your story makes people lean in. And because you're human, you naturally think, perhaps I should tell it that way again. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with learning. There's nothing wrong with becoming a better communicator, as I said. Craft matters. The way we tell our stories matters. The way we structure our ideas matters. I spend hours thinking about these episodes before you ever hear them. Not because I'm trying to manufacture emotions, but because I care deeply about stewarding your attention well. And that's craft. Building a craft or honing a craft, it asks you, how can I communicate this more clearly? And it's very imperative and important to actually consider that. Because if you really truly want to land a message, sometimes you have to think about the clarity that you must lend it. You must think about, who is it for? It is not performance. Performance asks, how can I become what they want? So there's a difference. I hope you got that. So craft asks, how can I communicate this more clearly? And then performance asks, how can I become what they want? Right? So performance asks you to morph yourself into what is acceptable, what can be received well, whereas crafts ask, how can I mold what I'm putting out there in a way in which they can understand it better? So one serves as the truth and the other slowly replaces it. Those are two different questions. And I think that's the question that we all need to revisit from time to time. Not just those of us who create publicly, but I mean, parents, leaders, managers, friends, partners, we all perform versions of ourselves sometimes. The capable one, the strong one, the funny one, the one who always has the answer, the one who never needs help, the one who has healed enough to always know what to say. Sometimes we become so committed to maintaining that version that we stop allowing ourselves to keep learning. And that's a costly thing because growth requires honesty. And honesty sometimes sounds like, I've changed my mind. And sometimes even walking into the room and saying, I actually don't hold the answer. I don't know anymore. Or I thought I had healed that. And being honest with yourself as well, because sometimes we can believe our own lies, right? Be honest with yourself. I thought I had healed that. Or simply, I am still learning. I am still learning. I don't know if you've ever changed rooms or started something new and you had to actually constantly remind yourself when you get too hard on yourself that I am actually learning in real time. And it's not going to look good. It's not going to feel good. It's going to feel uncomfortable instead. But there are moments where you're going to have to offer yourself grace while you're learning in real time, while you're doing mistakes, while you look very much clumsy and disorganized until you form your own rhythm and you're able to get into the rhythm and present yourself well. You need to allow yourself that level of grace that not so many people will do so, but for yourself so that you're able to progress forward, right? I've come to believe that people don't trust perfection nearly as much as they trust congruence. They trust someone whose public life resembles their private conviction. Not because they are flawless, but because they are whole. So what is the alternative? If hiding isn't the answer, and if performing isn't the answer, what is, right? You're probably asking yourself, what is? I've been calling it rooted visibility. This is the kind of visibility that grows from the inside out, not from pressure or comparison or proving yourself, but rootedness, one that is anchored within yourself. I imagine it like a tree, maybe a baobab tree, a huge majestic tree. Well, before it became majestic, right, it had to grow from being small to that rootedness, right? The part everyone notices is the part above the ground. The branches, the leaves, the fruit, but none of that exists without the roots. And here's what I've noticed. The more visible your life becomes, the more intentional your roots need to become. And you hear me again, it's very, very critical, especially if you want to continue being visible without losing yourself. The more visible your life becomes, the more intentional your roots need to become. Because visibility has a way of pulling your attention outwards. You begin wondering what people think, how they interpreted what you said, whether they liked it, whether they agreed, whether they understood. And without realizing it, your center slowly shifts. Instead of living from within yourself, you begin living from everyone's response to you. And that's exhausting. Trust you me, that's very much exhausting because people are inconsistent, just like you. People change their minds. People receive things. The very same thing that you'd say today, they'd receive it differently if you were to say it another day when they are in a better mood, right? People are inconsistent. Some days they'll celebrate you and other days they'll misunderstand you. Some will project onto you because that's the lens which we experience things outside of ourselves. It's more so a projection of the lives that we've lived internally and the coding that we have within ourselves. We then view the world from our internal worldview. We then interpret the world from our internal worldview, people's own beliefs of how the world should be. People are often walking, projecting. That's why you'll find weird things happening in this world. It's just person in their own worldview. And you're wondering, how could they actually live life like that? How could they be, So it's more a projection, right? Some will place expectations on you that you never agreed to carry. I think this one, you know it very much well. If your identity rises and falls with public opinions, peace will always feel temporary. But rooted visibility says something different. It says, I can listen without being led by every voice. I can receive feedback without surrendering my center. I can be fully present in public spaces without abandoning the person I am in private. That to me is maturity. So what do roots actually look like? I think they're much less glamorous than we imagine. Roots look like ordinary practices. They look like the life no one applauds, the journal that no one reads, the prayer that no one hears, the walk where your phone stays in your pocket, the conversation with people who knew you before anyone else knew your work, the people who call you by your first name, the people who actually know your name, not your title, who ask, how are you really? How's your heart today? Instead of, how's everything going? Generalizing, how's everything going? I've become increasingly protective of those spaces, of those people, of those relationships that are called with them, because they remind me who I am. Before the work, before the audience, before the opportunities, before the matrix, the analytics, and thinking and defining myself based on analytics and numbers. Those places don't ask me to produce anything. They simply ask me to be present, to be there, to be myself, come as I am. And I think every person becoming more visible needs somewhere where nothing is expected of them, where they don't have to be insightful or inspiring or articulate, but just human as you are. I smile because that's how, if you have kids, if you're blessed to have kids, that's exactly what they ask of you. They don't ask you to solve things for them sometimes. They just want you to listen, to be there. You don't have to be inspiring or articulate, but just be human with them. So that's one grounding place that for me is such a sanctuary, my home. Because if every room requires something from you, eventually you'll forget how to simply exist. Eventually, you'll forget how to simply exist. The first practice I've been learning is remembering why I chose visibility in the first place. Every now and then I have to ask myself, if no one applauded this, will I still say it? That question has saved me more times than I can count, because sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the honest answer is no. Sometimes I realize I have been chasing affirmation more than contribution, and there's no shame in noticing that. We all need affirmation, but affirmation cannot become the compass. It cannot become the thing that you constantly seek. Contribution has to remain the compass. When I started writing years ago, I wasn't trying to become known. I was trying to make sense of my own life. Writing helped me hear myself. I often say this. Writing helped me hear myself. The audience came later. The podcast came later. The opportunities came later. If I ever forget why I began, I'll slowly begin creating for applause instead of conviction. And conviction lasts much longer than applause ever does. Applause are loud, yes, they are loud. It's funny enough that for me, applause actually make me fold. But conviction is quiet. Conviction is quiet, and conviction stays with you long after the room has emptied, right? That's a voice I'm learning to trust over and over and over again. The second practice is protecting what is still becoming. I think we are living in a culture that asks to narrate our lives before we are actually living them, before we've actually lived them. Every feeling becomes content, every lesson becomes a post, every difficult season becomes something we are expected to explain in real time. But I've realized something. Not everything sacred is meant for immediate sharing. Not everything sacred is meant for immediate sharing. Some seasons really truly need privacy, not secrecy, which is totally different, but privacy. There's a difference between the two. Secrecy hides from shame. Privacy protects what is still growing, what is still fragile. The same way which, as African people, we are taught to protect hangwana fits all. You don't just put them out there. You need to protect them for the first 3 months at least until mohai, without putting them out there. And that's privacy. There's sacred things that you need to protect in your life. Then only you, when you're discerning enough, you'll know and understand what exactly it is that in your life you need to still protect because it's sacred. You wouldn't dig up a seed every morning to check whether it's growing, right? You leave it in the soil. You trust the process. You allow time to do what only time can do. I think our inner lives deserves that same patience, that very same patience. There are things I'm living right now that I may never speak about publicly, that others I'll share years from now, once they've become wisdom instead of fresh wounds. And I've made peace with that because I've learned that not everything real needs an audience. Some things simply need your full attention. And perhaps that's the invitation for you today, to stop asking, should I share this? And instead ask, has this finished forming me yet? Or has this finished forming in me yet? Sometimes the answer will be yes. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let it remain yours for a little longer. Let it remain yours for a while longer before you can put it out there. And I'm learning this too with you, by the way. I appreciate this space so much because it also allows me to sit and reflect. And it being in an audio format, I can sit here and speak even in my pajamas. By the way, I'm sitting here in my pajamas this morning recording this episode for you. It's going to be coming out on Tuesday. It allows me to sit in my comfort, in my truth, and to speak from that place as opposed to speak from a place of performance. And I think removing the video element, it allowed me to actually ground myself in that. I'm just saying this because as I'm speaking through this to you, I'm realizing that for myself, I'm also learning, So yeah. And then the third practice. The third practice has become one of the most important ones for me. And honestly, I'm still learning, as I said. It's the practice of returning to yourself after the world has had access to you. I don't think we speak about this enough. We talk a great deal about showing up, about putting yourself out there, about finding your voice. But we rarely talk about what happens after. After the meeting, after the keynote, after the episode goes live, after the interview, after the promotion, after the room applauds, after the comments begin to come in, after everyone has had a chance to tell you what they thought of you. What happens then? Who do you become once the room is quiet again? I've noticed something over the past few years. The louder life becomes outside, on the outside, the quieter I have to become on the inside. Not withdrawn, and not disconnected, but just intentional. I've learned not to rush towards everyone's opinion before I spend time with my own. I've learned not to immediately measure whether something was successful by how many people responded to it. Because if every piece of work sends me looking for confirmation, Then eventually I stopped creating from freedom. I began creating from dependency, right? Depending on whether people will respond, depending on whether this will grow the audience. And those two things produce very different lives again. So I've started giving myself permission to return, to close the laptop, to leave the phone on the other room, to make tea, to sit in the patio, to write in my journal without documenting it before reading what anyone else has written about the episode that I've released, to remember that before I am someone's anything, I am simply Larato. I am a woman learning, I am a woman becoming, I am a woman evolving, I am a woman still growing into the life she once prayed for. That return changes everything because it reminds me that my identity has somewhere deeper to live than public opinions. And perhaps your return looks different. Maybe yours is a run. Maybe it's tending your garden. Maybe it's baking. Maybe it's sitting in prayer before the house wakes up. Maybe it's dinner around the table with your family when no one asks about your achievements. Whatever it is, don't lose it. Because there will always be another meeting, another opportunity, another audience, another milestone. But there's only one you. And she deserves to keep meeting herself again and again. Something I am learning, and can I confess something to you? The season of my life has asked more of me than I expected. There are more rooms, more responsibilities, more opportunities, more people, more decisions. And every now and then I notice the temptation to become more polished than present, to become more impressive than honest, to always sound like I know exactly what I'm doing or where I'm going. I sometimes don't know, but I'm believing that the little seed that I choose to actually put on the ground every day will someday become something. Because certainty, to be quite honest, is often rewarded, right? But certainty isn't always truthful. Because you don't really know the future. You have not met the future. How could you be certain that it will unfold exactly like that? Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the truest thing I can say is, I'm still figuring it out. I'm still learning as I go. And strangely enough, that's become one of the most freeing discoveries of adulthood. That I don't have to arrive before I speak. I simply have to speak honestly from where I am. That's different. Living content has never been about arriving. It's about paying attention. It's about noticing what life is teaching us while we are still living it, right? And inviting each other into that conversation. Not because we have mastered it, but because we are committed to remaining awake to it. That's why I still write. That's why I still come back behind this microphone. Again, it's not because I have all the answers, but because I believe paying attention is one of the most sacred form of leadership. And this kind of leadership is the one that begins with yourself. So before we leave each other today, I want to speak to 3 people. The first is the person who has been hiding, not because you lack ability and not because you aren't ready, but because somewhere along the way, you became convinced that visibility required you to become someone you don't recognize. I hope today's conversation reminds you it doesn't. The world doesn't need another polished version of yourself, of someone else, but you. It needs the particular perspective that only your life has given you. Your voice, your story, your questions, the way you see life, the way you think, the way you process it. Please don't keep that hidden forever. Then there's the person who already is visible. Perhaps people know your work. Perhaps you are leading teams. Perhaps you are building something meaningful, showing up consistently, but quietly you've started feeling the distance between who you are and who everyone else expects of you and expect you to be. Can I gently encourage you? Pause. Not quit, not to disappear, simply to return. Return to the source, return to your values, return to the reason you began. because your work deserves your wholeness more than it deserves your performance. And finally, to the person who's only just beginning, the one standing at the edge, wondering whether to publish, whether to apply, whether to speak, whether to raise your hand, whether to finally let yourself be seen. I hope you start the way you intend to continue. Don't build a life you'll eventually have to recover from. Build one that allows you to keep recognizing yourself every step of the way. And as always, before I close, I'd love to leave you with 3 questions to carry into your week. The first, where in your life are you confusing being visible with being truly seen? The second, is there a version of yourself you've been maintaining that no longer feels completely true? Not because you're dishonest, but because you've grown. What would it look like to honor who you are becoming? And finally, where do you go to hear your own voice again after everyone else has become so loud? Don't rush those questions, but sit with them, journal them, reflect on them, take them to your own walks this week. May you discover that the answers have been quietly waiting for you. And before I finally leave you, let me leave you with this. You do not have to disappear to protect your peace. And you do not have to perform to deserve being seen. There's another way, a quieter way, a slower way, a truer way. The path where your work grows without your soul shrinking. The path where your influence expands without your identity becoming smaller. The path where people meet your work, and in doing so, they genuinely meet you. That's the path I want to keep choosing. And perhaps that's the path you're being invited to choose too. So sis, family, thank you for spending this time with me. Every week I leave these conversations feeling reminded that we are not walking this journey alone. If this episode gave language to something you've been carrying, I'd love to hear from you. Honestly, please comment, send me messages that you can send. Come and find me on Instagram. Send me a message. Tell me what stayed with you. Those conversations have become some of my favorite parts of this community. And if there's someone in your life who's stepping into a bigger season, a new role, a dream, a chapter, share this episode with them, not as a reminder to become louder, but as a permission to remain themselves while they grow. If you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss what's coming next. We are continuing this conversation about self-leadership, about becoming, evolving, about building lives that are deeply rooted before we are widely recognized. Until next time, be gentle with yourself, pay attention to your life, and whatever the season asks of you, don't leave yourself behind. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to this episode. I really do appreciate you for being here. Please remember to share your love openly here by subscribing, sharing these episodes, and also just adding your feedback on the reviews. So this podcast can also be easily found by those in similar journeys and needing the message here. I would love to hear how the podcast is helping you. So do share that too with me, and be sure to check the podcast out on Instagram. Keep well. Chat to you soon.